The fluorescent lights of Terminal 4 flickered with a tired hum, mirroring the exhaustion etched into Arthur's face. At 78, his joints protested every mile, and the cross-country flight to see his newborn great-granddaughter felt longer than the Oregon Trail. Beside him, Martha, his wife of 54 years, sat perched on a rigid plastic chair, her hand resting gently on her carry-on. "We're almost there, Artie," she whispered, her voice like soft velvet. "Just 5 hours in the air and then we're holding that baby." Arthur smiled, his eyes crinkling. They had splurged on 2 seats in the very first row of Economy Plus, row 7. It provided the extra legroom Arthur's titanium hip desperately required and kept them close to the exit. It was a rare luxury they had saved for months to afford. When the gate agent announced boarding for Group 1, Arthur gripped his cane and Martha took his arm. They settled into 7A and 7B. Arthur exhaled a long breath of relief as he stretched his leg into the spacious cutout. "Perfect," he muttered. But the peace was short-lived. The arrival of the storm. The silence of the cabin was punctured by a sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels and the heavy thud of a backpack hitting a seatback. "Move it, Jackson, if we don't get the bags up now, someone will steal our space," a voice shrilled. Arthur looked up to see a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in designer athleisure and an expression of permanent dissatisfaction. Behind her trailed a boy of about 12, slumped over a gaming console, wearing massive noise-canceling headphones. The woman stopped at row 7. She looked at her ticket, then at Arthur and Martha, then back at her ticket. Her brow furrowed. She didn't look for her own seats, she looked at theirs with an air of entitlement that chilled the air. "Excuse me," she said, tapping the back of Martha's headrest. "You're in our seats." Martha blinked, her kind eyes widening. "Oh, I don't think so, dear, we're 7A and 7BC. She pointed a trembling finger at the boarding pass tucked into her book. The woman, whose name tag on her designer tote read Brenda, didn't even look. "There must be a mistake at the desk then. My son, Jackson, has very severe claustrophobia. He needs the bulkhead, he needs the open space, or he'll have a panic attack. We're back in row 24 near the bathrooms. It's disgusting back there. You two need to switch with us." Arthur cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to hear about your son, ma'am, but I have a fused hip and a heart condition. We specifically booked these seats months ago for the legroom." Brenda's face reddened. She didn't offer sympathy, she offered a scoff. "Are you serious? You're retired, you have all the time in the world to sit and recover. My son is a growing boy, he has a soccer tournament tomorrow, he needs to be comfortable, look at him." Jackson didn't look like he was suffering. He was leaning against the galley wall, vigorously tapping his screen, completely oblivious to his mother's crusade. "We aren't moving," Arthur said firmly, though his hand shook slightly on the armrest. The escalation. Brenda turned her attention to Martha, sensing perhaps a softer target. "Ma'am, surely you understand, you're a grandmother, right? Don't you care about the well-being of a child? He's just a boy, you're being incredibly selfish, it's just a seat." Martha looked at Jackson, then back at Brenda. Her expression wasn't angry, it was pensive. "It is just a seat, dear, which is why I wonder why you're making such a fuss. If it's just a seat, row 24 will be fine for you." The surrounding passengers began to whisper. A young man in 8C leaned forward. "Hey lady, they paid for those seats, leave them alone." Brenda snapped her head around. "Stay out of this, this is a medical necessity." She turned back to the couple, her voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "If you don't move, I'm going to call the flight attendant and tell them you're harassing my son. I'll make sure you're kicked off this flight. Is that what you want, to miss your trip because you were too stubborn to move 10 rows back?" Arthur felt his chest tighten. He hated conflict. He looked at Martha, ready to give in just to keep the peace. "Maybe we should just..." But Martha gripped his hand, hard. "Grandma takes a stand." Martha stood up. She wasn't tall, barely 5'2", but in that moment she seemed to tower over the cabin. She smoothed her floral blouse and looked Brenda directly in the eye. "Dear," Martha said, her voice projecting with a sudden, startling clarity that silenced the entire front section of the plane. "I have spent 40 years teaching middle school. I know the difference between a medical emergency and a temper tantrum. I also know the difference between a mother protecting her child and a woman who thinks the world owes her a favor." Brenda opened her mouth to interrupt, but Martha held up a single, authoritative finger. "I am not finished. My husband survived 2 tours in Vietnam and 3 surgeries on his legs. He worked 45 years at the post office so we could afford to fly comfortably in our twilight years. We are going to see a baby who will never know her great-grandfather if he dies of a blood clot in row 24 because he couldn't move his legs. She glanced at Jackson, and you, young man. Jackson looked up, startled by the sound of his name. He pulled his headphones down. Do you have claustrophobia? Martha asked. Jackson blinked, confused. What? No, I just wanted the window seat to see the clouds, but Mom said she'd get me the one with the most legroom so I could plug in my charger. The cabin erupted in a low ooh of realization. Brenda's face went from red to a deep, bruised purple. Jackson, shut up, Brenda hissed. No, don't tell him to shut up, Martha said, her voice softening but remaining steel-toed. You are teaching this boy that the way to get through life is to bully those you perceive as weaker. You are teaching him that his comfort is more important than an old man's health. That is a heavy burden to put on a child. The climax. At that moment, a flight attendant named Sarah arrived, alerted by the commotion. Is there a problem here, folks? Brenda immediately lunged for the narrative. Yes, these people are being incredibly rude and aggressive. They're upsetting my son. We need these seats for his condition, and they're refusing to cooperate with the seating arrangement I was promised. Sarah looked at the manifest on her tablet. Ma'am, you are assigned 24E and 24F. These passengers are in their assigned seats. Is there a medical note on file for your son? It's a private matter, Brenda stammered. But look at them, they're fine, they can walk, they're just being difficult. Arthur spoke up, his voice steady now, bolstered by Martha's strength. Miss, we would like to stay in the seats we paid for. We've done nothing but sit here and try to enjoy our trip. Sarah looked at Brenda. Ma'am, you need to move to row 24 immediately. You are hovering in the galley and delaying the boarding process. If you continue to harass these passengers, I will have to call the gate agent and have you escorted off the aircraft for disruptive behavior. Brenda looked around. Every eye in the cabin was on her. There were no sympathetic faces. Even Jackson looked embarrassed, his face buried back in his game, trying to disappear into his hoodie. This is ridiculous, Brenda muttered, grabbing Jackson's arm. Fine, enjoy your victory. I hope you're happy making a child suffer. He isn't suffering, Brenda, Martha said quietly as the woman turned to leave. He's just learning. I hope today he learns something better than what you're teaching him. The journey onward. As Brenda and a humiliated Jackson retreated toward the back of the plane, a spontaneous, muffled round of applause broke out from the first few rows. Arthur sank back into his seat, his heart finally slowing its frantic pace. Good heavens, Martha, he exhaled. I haven't seen you use that teacher voice since 1994. Martha sat back down and adjusted her seatbelt with a click. She looked perfectly composed, as if she hadn't just faced down a whirlwind of entitlement. Some people never grow out of the playground, Artie, they just get bigger shoes. The flight was smooth. Every time Sarah, the flight attendant, walked by, she brought Arthur an extra pillow or a fresh glass of water. Thanks for handling that with such grace, she whispered to Martha halfway through the flight. We see it all the time, but rarely does someone stand their ground so politely. Arthur watched the clouds through the window. He thought about how easy it would have been to just move, to spend 5 hours in agony, cramping his leg and risking his health just to avoid a scene. He looked at Martha, who was now peacefully reading her mystery novel. He realized that Martha hadn't just been fighting for a seat. She had been fighting for the principle that age doesn't mean invisibility. Being elderly didn't mean they were required to disappear to make room for the loud and the demanding. A meaningful conclusion. When the plane finally touched down in Charlotte, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, thanking them for flying. As the fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, Arthur and Martha began to gather their things. From several rows back, they saw Brenda and Jackson shuffling toward the exit. Brenda looked exhausted, her hair frizzy and her mouth set in a sour line. Jackson, however, did something unexpected. As he passed row 7, he paused. He looked at Martha, then at Arthur's cane. Sorry about my mom, he mumbled so low only they could hear it. I didn't know about your leg. Martha smiled, a genuine, warm beam of light. Thank you, Jackson, you're a good boy. Remember that you get to choose who you want to be. The boy nodded quickly and hurried to catch up with his mother, who was already complaining to a gate agent about the unprofessionalism of the cabin crew. Arthur and Martha stepped off the plane and into the warm, humid air of the jetway. At the end of the tunnel, their grandson was waiting, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. As Arthur took the baby into his arms, the pain in his hip seemed to vanish. He looked at Martha, who was beaming at their new legacy. They had held their ground, and because of it, they arrived with the strength to enjoy this moment. The title of the story of their life wasn't about the conflict they had endured, but the dignity they maintained. It was a simple truth they had proven at 30,000 feet. Kindness is not weakness, and a quiet spirit can weather any storm. "Worth it?" Martha asked, leaning her head on Arthur's shoulder as they watched the baby sleep. "Every bit," Arthur replied. "Especially seeing you in action. Remind me never to take your seat, Martha." She laughed, the sound echoing happily through the terminal. "Don't worry, Artie. As long as you're next to me, you're exactly where you're supposed to be."